Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/BSW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter. Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I'm your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Paul Asadoorian. Sign up for Pandora Podcasting Early Access. Go to www.pandorapodcastbeta.splashthat.com to get access to our podcast on Pandora. The full release will be available sometime in December. Also, go to go.stealthbits.com/2019 trends to register for StealthBits webcast, emerging and continuing trends in 2019, privacy regulations, Active Directory security, and machine learning, for an in-depth discussion from Gabriel Gumbs and Paul Asadoorian. You can also view their assessment at www.stealthbits.com/assessment. All right, too many wwws for me, guys. All right, Now we get into the leadership articles for this week. And there's actually two articles that I thought were pretty interesting that tie really closely into the last discussion we just had with Richard Seierson. The first one is risk assessments essential to secure third-party vendor management. I think as some people know, I started some of my GRC background in doing third-party vendor management. In 2003, I ran the third-party vendor management program for one of the top 10 national banks out of Cleveland, where I had to manage 70,000 vendors. And the problem has not gone away. This article gets into some very interesting aspects about a couple things. One is understand your critical and high-risk vendors. All vendors have a risk, some sort of risk. And what you need to try to do is prioritize the highs and the criticals based on a set of criteria, and then understand what risks they pose to your organization. This also then extends into what's called fourth party risk, those third parties that outsource to other third parties. And it's very difficult for a lot of organizations to understand not only their third party risk, but their fourth party risk, that next step. And this article talks about some techniques to identify who's critical and high risk, what some of the criteria you need to look at for, talks about the fourth parties, but then also prepare to change vendors. And we've seen some of this over the years, is you can see the need or the opportunity to change providers because you can get a better, maybe a lower risk from a competitor or from somebody else, and not expose your company to that. So think about the exit strategy. It also talks a little bit about how, as a third party, if you're prepared for some of these security questions, it can actually provide a competitive advantage. I think the other challenge in the market right now is if you're a third party, well, why do I need to do this? And you get bombarded with these questionnaires. But if you were proactive and you use security in answering some of these questionnaires, you can actually use it as a competitive advantage to proactively go win business, maybe displacing a competitor because you have a better security risk story. So a really interesting article that I thought tied in pretty well with our last conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking of this more as a data analytics exercise and less of actually assessing the security of this company, right? And I think they're two totally different things. And I don't think you can speak authoritatively about the security of another company without actually being there and like hands-on looking at stuff and actually doing a test. And that is part of some of the, validation services. But if you step outside of that and you look at it from an analytics perspective, you can certainly come up with a range, right? And that's what these companies are helping you do, is say this one is more riskier than this one based on how we asked the questions, what questions we asked, and their answers. So I think it is a good thing to keep in mind, but also keep in mind that we're not actually like testing these companies' security in most cases, and that may play into some as well. But
yeah, and here it's the basic risk assessment is to gauge that level of risk. What service are they providing? Is it internet facing? That's one of the old questions we used to ask. What kind of data do they have access to? Is it PII data or not PII data? Simple questions like that, and how you're using that third party and the data they have access to will give you a good idea of where some of that potential risk is. When I first got to the bank, I remember the conversation. I said, okay, where is all your high risk vendors? And they said, well, here it is. It's based on revenue spend. I'm like, yeah, okay, you spend a lot of money with IBM, but is IBM really that risky? Because they actually, they own a security company. They bought ISS back then, and so they knew security. I said, okay, so you've got this printer that's printing statements for your high wealth customers, and they have access to their social security numbers, but you don't spend a lot with them. Is that risky? That's what I mean by how.
Yes.
What are how are you using them, and what kind of data do they have access to is sometimes way more important than how much you're spending.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we've had to fill out some of those questionnaires as well. And we're like, we don't collect that data, but we still got to fill out the 200 questions, right? And I think, it's certainly Jason Albuquerque opened my eyes to this from Carousel, and he's like, you got to ask the right questions and not make everyone, go through all 200, because how is that benefiting anyone? Right? Like, what are you really concerned about, and focus on that?
Yes. And 200's light these days based on some of these questionnaires that I've seen. I've seen them up to 1,000 questions. It's crazy.
It's crazy. And so if you're saying that we don't collect any data, right, you should go back in your processes and verify that. I mean, you should have technology and processes that say, yeah, no, we're really not sharing that data with them. And if you are, you got to go back and say, well, you check the box that you weren't collecting, you didn't get this data, but you are. So now it's a different conversation.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's one of the reasons why we created gating questions in Control Path back in the day. So if you answered a question a certain way, you could ignore a big chunk of that questionnaire.
Exactly.
Yes, Excel doesn't work that way. The second article, which ties into this one, then is the multi-million-dollar question of cyber risk. Do you invest now or do you pay later? And this article gets into, again, aspects of what's the true cost of a breach. If you don't make the security investments now and you get breached, or you can't enter into new markets, that potentially has more cost associated with it than it would have been to make some of those security investments up front. So this article gets into, the debate of, do I invest in security up front and hope that I don't get a breach or an attack? What's the ramifications if you are breached? I think most of us know that the cost of a breach includes customer loss, brand reputation, potentially operational productivity loss, which would impact revenue, potentially earnings. These are all things that have an impact to the business as a whole that have to be measured and understood. This article also talks about how do you use security as a competitive advantage. Again, similar to the third party discussion, but can I use security and being more secure as a competitive advantage to win customers, to move into new markets that my competition can't move into because I've addressed some of these issues up front. Again, it's the age-old question that all CISOs, I think, have to answer, and every board will ultimately have to answer, is now or later, but you're going to pay one way or the other.
And I think it's interesting how absent from a lot of these articles that analyze the post-breach kind of state of an organization, they all talk about customer loss, brand reputation, and productivity, basically, and direct costs associated with dealing with the breach. But what about after? So, like, you've done the initial incident response. To me, the pieces that are most often missing are, what about employees that are leaving, right? What about those employees that are like, we knew this process was broken, and we tried to fix it, but no one would listen, right? And then what about leadership that might leave the organization for one way, that maybe they get fired or maybe they just leave, and now you've got to refill that position. And all of it does speak to, loss of productivity, but then also now you've got to fix those processes, right? If you're serious about fixing security. So now you got to bring in technology and change processes, which is taking you away from like writing code or your mission as a company. So I think that the true effect of a breach isn't often covered in many articles that we read. And what if your employees decide to leave because you've had a breach and they're like, you know what, I'm going to go get a job somewhere else where the company does really truly care about security.
Yeah, and it's playing catch up and not focusing on business growth, which means you could be at a disadvantage against your competition who isn't doing that, because that allows them to continue to innovate and move forward in the market. So
right, and you get focused on catching up on your technical or your security debt rather than pushing out new features.
Correct. Yep. Next article on I think all of us know this. Digital tech is transforming the business ecosystem. It's kind of a no-brainer here, but if we think about it for a second, digital transformation brings in a whole new set of things that weren't there before in the business side, right? We've got new devices and new ways of transacting business, and obviously the internet. And so we've seen this trend for a while. I've been a big proponent of, look, the digital transformation is going to happen. It's companies are driving digital transformation to be more in line with their customers, be more responsive, and to continue to grow. That's also changing a lot of how business is getting done and the systems that we're interacting with to transact business. So, kind of a no-brainer here. It actually talks about how India is making huge investments in India to be ready to have 5 billion devices connected by 2020 or 2022, right? So making major investments in their ecosystem and in their environment to support this growth of new devices that are going to connect into India, and how you have to think about, being ahead of this. Otherwise, you won't be able to continue to serve all these new devices that are coming online.
Yeah, and it's interesting, locally, I think we've seen what I would call lack of trying to keep up with the digital transformation. We see it in our industry too. Several local businesses are just no longer. And I think one of the reasons is they just haven't kept up with the technology, to be quite honest. I mean, you're going to use a pharmacy because they send you text messages when your prescription is ready. And that's becoming, from a consumer and from a business perspective, the features that you're looking for. And if you're not adapting and changing, as has been the case in business forever, if you're not embracing technology, you're going to lose out. And we're seeing that again locally, so many places. Restaurants are another example. The food service industry. If you're not on, Uber Eats or one of those other things and embracing this, new technology, you're missing. If you can't place an order online, like those are becoming the norm. And if you're not keeping up with that, the businesses that are succeeding are the ones that are staying ahead of it.
Yeah, so I heard this morning, everybody's breaking down the Black Friday numbers from last week after Thanksgiving. Retail store sales were down. Where they expect to make up the difference is all on the online side.
Yeah.
So online numbers are up. Today's Cyber Monday. They're expecting like $7 billion in transactions today, 17% growth. But retail store numbers are down because people are embracing technology. They're buying more online. You're going to see this not only in retail, but to your point, pharmacies and in other areas where the traditional brick and mortar stuff, you could continue to see declines because what you're seeing is the growth on the online side. And I just thought it was interesting numbers is, we got a really healthy economy, but retail store numbers are down because more people are doing it online.
Well, and it's interesting too, a lot of the new services incorporate technology to make it easier for consumers. For example, I think Walmart and Target now, both, CVS had this, where you place your order online on your phone and you drive into the parking lot and someone brings it out and puts it in your car. And for like my wife, like moms with kids that are driving around, and I experienced this too. Like the last thing you want to do is drag your kids out of the car and take them in a store. It's like the most of the time an awful experience, right? So, but to be able to just drive up and have them delivered. Now, are you going to do your shopping at a place that has that, or are you going to go to all these boutique stores, right? I mean, and though I think that really speaks to the digital transformation story that you posted.
Yeah. Yeah, who wants to haul all those kids and throw them in the cart and push them through the store, right?
Yeah, not to mention germs in the winter too. I mean, if you got a 2-year-old, they're gonna lick the carriage handle at some point, right? You want to avoid that. They do need to do that every once in a while to build up immunity. I'm just saying,
That's true. That is true. Or get a flu shot, one or the other,
right? Or both.
or both. All right. So 6 technologies execs say are overdone. I love this list because there's a number of them on here that I just completely agree with. So what they do is they talk to different execs from different companies
Mhm.
and ask them what is the most overused kind of term technology. So the first one is digital transformation, which we talked about earlier. Um, a lot of people talk about digital transformation. So the term is obviously overdone. What he says though is describe it as the capabilities that you're enabling. Digital transformation is this kind of big umbrella term, but if you can think about this more as what are the different capabilities or things that you want to do as part of that digital transformation. So break it down, don't use that broad term, break it down into capabilities. I thought that was pretty interesting.
I like Julie from Lululemon. It's awesome.
Yes.
She says, "I'm tired of email. Can't wait till email goes away." And Julie, you and I couldn't agree more. I'm a huge fan of identifying stuff that's overused in email and finding the right solution for it. And I think the reason why people use email as a crutch is because everyone has email and we can, move forward. But there's so many better technologies for so many different processes that don't require email. And there's so many benefits of not using email. Email is so hard to track. It's easy to lose email. Your process can fall down. And the other thing from running a business is the metrics that you're missing, right? How do I measure the success of some kind of process if it's an email? I really can't, right? That's why we use tools like HubSpot and other tools. And from a security process too, if you're sitting there as a CISO or you're moving into that role, and your company's processes, what's being relied upon in terms of email, right? Start thinking about how you move those off so that you can measure and track it as a CISO. And going back to our previous discussion on metrics, you have to be able to collect that data and show open and close tickets or security events moving into different processes, not just being battered around in email. That doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, we don't use that much email internally. We Signal or Slack each other, right?
Yep.
If we have quick questions, you don't
Signal,
use
Slack.
email,
Yep.
right? You don't use email
And
to do
I
that.
would say, and I've talked about this before, Matt, the next evil thing with email is document sharing systems, right? And
Mhm.
spreadsheets and Word docs and Drive and Office 365, SharePoint, right? That's almost as bad. And so many of our processes still in security today, like where would we be without the spreadsheet, right? But there's better ways, obviously.
We're trying to get off that spreadsheet. We're trying to get it
And it's hard. And I'm not saying it's not hard. It's hard because it is
hard.
easy and it's a great tool to have things like spreadsheets and documents, but you lose so much in the way of process and time, I think, by doing those things. So
Yes. The next one is artificial intelligence. Yes, way overused as
mhm.
well. Kevin Ubert from Vitamix says it's more about augmented intelligence. The term artificial intelligence, a lot of people assume that it's going to replace the human. What he's
Yeah.
saying is, look, a lot of this technology is really augmenting our intelligence to help make better decisions. It's not replacing us. And so, it is a term we've talked about it on the show, artificial intelligence and machine learning and these pieces, but a lot of people use the term generically and a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, we're going to get rid of the human. No, we're not getting rid of the human. We're going to try to make the human a little more efficient, let's hopefully, in some of our processes, but not. not replace us.
I completely agree with him. Yeah, it is. You're really augmenting the human intelligence. You're not replacing it in so many cases. And if you are, it's only so much. Like those chatbots, for example, it's only so much of the conversation that can be had artificially, right? Until you got to go off into a human. So,
Yep. Number 4 from Cisco. Security is independent. No, it's not. Everybody wants their business to be secure. We were, again, back to our discussion with Richard, the integration of security and building security into the business. Security has to be part of the business. And so his point here is, everybody talks about how security is an independent part. Now really should be fully integrated in with not only your engineering processes, as we talked about with Richard, but your business processes and in the business itself.
yep.
Let's see, number 5, Internet of Things. Again, a super overused term. It's funny, he's at Avis now, who wrote this one, but came from ADT, and ADT was all about home security and securing the home, and then IoT came out, and it was like, oh, it's the Internet of Things security and all this other stuff, right? And so we've used this term over and over and over again, and I think the challenge with it is the Internet of Things, or the industrial Internet of Things, is a bunch of things. It's and I think about things in smaller little buckets, right? We know that autonomous vehicle has a bunch of sensors and devices in it. Yes, classified as the Internet of Things, but serving a purpose of sensor inputs for autonomous vehicles, for example. You have industrial devices and sensors that are used to measure when aircraft engines need to be done for maintenance, right? And there are very specific use cases of how these devices, but everybody uses this term so broadly now that it's kind of a little overwhelming these days.
Yeah, I think that you hit on the number one problem with IoT, right? Is that it means so many different things to so many different people, right? There's the consumer devices that we talk about, like as in your Wi-Fi routers or home gateways. There's the industrial Internet of Things, right, which is really an ICS security issue that we've had that for years, right? We've had some kind of connectivity in those systems, there's like all these other subcategories. There's how you solve the problem today. There's how you get. I mean, there's so much that I think we and vendors, right, are saying IoT just to like use the buzz term, but it's not appropriate. And it depends on so many factors to really frame the conversation about what you're talking about. And look, everyone has their IoT security solution, and I only see one true solution, and that is how to architect the entire system that surrounds your device so that it's secure. And that's not going to happen for some time. I think there are people who are doing it right today, but there's the rest of the 95% of the technology industry in general, that is behind in some capacity. And how you deploy these devices, how they communicate, how they're updated, how they're managed is really the crux of the issue when it comes to IoT security. And so many people are just not talking about that, right? Which is why I'll bring it up again. The Microsoft Azure Sphere is a fantastic framework, right? Now the project is just launching, but to me that represents a true solution to help people create technology that uses devices. Let's face it, we're all going to use some kind of device or are today, but allows you to do that in a secure framework. And that's a lot of components to that.
Yeah, and you have commercial use, you have consumer use. They're completely different solutions. Trying to solve the IoT consumer problem is going to be very different, in my opinion, than solving the commercial IoT use case, where something like Sphere makes a lot of sense to build a complete secure kind of ecosystem around that specific use case versus consumer. It's going to, I still think it's hodgepodge, right? It's going to be, well, I got a Nest and I got an Alexa and a couple of these and a couple of those. Really hard to kind of think about how to secure those environments that are very, very heterogeneous from different manufacturers all over the place.
Yeah, and ultimately it comes down to risk for the consumer. And what if one IoT system you're using is implemented well? They're using a framework like Azure Sphere to deploy and manage your device, right? And there's some component of that, but the other things you're using aren't doing that. So you're still going to be at risk. Now, there's other companies that are trying to drop devices on your network to help secure all your Internet of Things. It's like another IoT device to secure all your other IoT devices. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. The last one on this list was interesting. It talks about low code systems, right? With this concept of, yeah, you need some level of manual coding, but it's low code. It's okay. You can't configure it without some level of coding. He talks about people moving to no code platforms and being able to do things more through configuration than coding. This example comes back, it reminds me of the old ERP days, right? Where you couldn't deploy an ERP system in less than like 5 years and
Yeah.
spending like $10 million or
Right.
whatever it was to deploy these systems. So
Yeah, I agree. I think most things are moving towards at least the lower code kind of systems
to no
as
code,
well. To
right?
no code, right? Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's likely an overused term as well, because low code in comparison to what, right? To zero code, or I don't know.
We'll see. I think there's always going to be some level of code. We're a software world now, so I think code is going to be around for a long time
Yeah,
in some
no, I
form or
completely
fashion.
agree with that.
Yeah. Dell did a study of Gen Z and identified that the biggest concern in IT is a lack of soft skills. So if you're a Gen Zer born after '96, which is all my children,
Mhm.
um, you're used to communicating on digital devices. And the concern now is that you don't have the soft skills. You can't get on a screen like this and have a conversation with people or an audience, right? Those skill sets are diminishing because you don't have to use those skills every day to talk to people at school or work or wherever because you're used to being on your devices. I think this is kind of a no-brainer study to me. Is we've already started to see this, right? Is the younger generation coming into the workforce, they're more comfortable with devices and less comfortable with the writing and the speaking skills and some of those other soft skills that are important in leadership and communication.
Yeah, I think the educational systems need to be aware of this too, and because I think they have likely the most influence over this problem, right? Because I know that there's certain courses or curriculum you can enroll in which really don't require much communication, right? It's all done electronically. Even a lot of colleges and universities, right? You can just enroll in the class. You never really have to show up to an actual classroom. Everyone communicates over text message, right? I think everyone needs to be in some type of system at some point that teaches communication and doesn't allow every interaction to be, over text message or some technology medium. I think it's super important to still teach those communication skills because, look, at some point you're going to likely need those skills in your career. I think in every career you need those skills. I'm just thinking you could have the greatest idea for a new company, but if you can't stand up and pitch to investors, likely not going to go very far.
Yeah, and this is why I think getting kids up and presenting in
Mm-hmm.
school on projects, book reports, whatever, I think is super important. I push my youngest there all the time. He's really shy about it. I'm like, dude, I hated it when I
Yeah,
was in
yeah,
high school. I couldn't stand up in front of the room without saying 50 ums. Truly, I couldn't. I mean, I remember going through English class doing. I was just terrified. I'm not now,
yeah. You got to
but
get over it.
I
Yep.
think it's important for those kids to get exposure to it in the classroom with their peers, get more comfortable and confident about presenting ideas and concepts and projects verbally
Yep.
with visual aids too. But I think it's so important because you're right. I can have the best idea in the world, but if I can't pitch it to an investor, I'm not getting funding.
Yep.
True, true. So this last article I pulled up was the 4 questions you must ask before making any decision. It's called the Cartesian coordinates, and I thought it was interesting because as I was going through kind of my next career move after the acquisition of Layered Insight, you get presented with a lot of opportunities, and you just kind of step back and you think, okay, well, how do I make the right decision? How do I analyze making that decision? And I didn't have this guide, but a couple of the pieces in here struck home to me because there are things that when you ask these questions about this specific topic, it helps you start to frame the what if scenarios a little better to help you make that right decision. And so I'm going to read off each one of these because I think they're important. The first one is what won't happen if you did the thing, right? So, what won't happen? The
Mhm.
example they give is you decide to quit your job and start your own company. Well, what won't happen is if you did it, the world's not going to end, right? Um, so it goes through some examples of playing that particular question. Then they pose it another way. What would happen if you did it? Well, if I did it, I may not have a steady income anymore because I'm on my own, and, and
Mhm.
and and now I have to, come up with that income, that stable aspect of the making that decision in that particular case is interesting. Then the third one is what won't happen if you didn't do it. Um, and you got to read that one a couple times because you're like, wait, what won't happen if you didn't do it? So it's taking the first one kind of in the opposite. Again, world's not going to end if you didn't do it, and in some other scenarios. So it's just an interesting way. And then the last one is what would happen if you didn't do it, right? So it's taking the second one and kind of flipping it on its head. And what it tells you to do is take the situation, run it through all of them, and then analyze your answers.
Mm.
Because if you're honest with yourself, if you're comfortable with all four of those responses, then you know you're making the right decision. And if you're not comfortable with one of them, then you really need to kind of inspect that aspect of the decision and understand, is that critical as part of your decision making process? So I thought it was just a really good way for people to, when they're making critical decisions, these are the four things that if you're comfortable, you're good to go. If not, maybe you should kind of look at some ancillary aspects before you make that final decision.
Yeah, I like this better than people used to tell me, like, make a list of pros and cons and all that stuff. I think this is a much better method. I think we might have mentioned it on the show in the past, but not talked about it in as much detail, at least as far as I remember. And I think it's a great framework as you're confronted with a lot of decisions in your any given day, especially as a CISO or working in security in that capacity. Lots of decisions, right? And it's interesting. We've covered other articles that talk about decreasing the number of decisions that you have to make in a day, like little things about like what you're going to wear for the day and all that stuff. There's some study that says the less decisions you have to make, the more I think brain power you'll have to confront the bigger decisions, and then have a framework like this to evaluate the bigger decisions. I think is really good.
I agree with you very much.
Cool.
All right, folks. I think that's the end of this show. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.